The Wyoming wind didn't blow. It screamed. It was a raw, scraping force that tore at the splintered wood of the Miller homestead, a sound as barren and desperate as the land itself. 3 years of drought had turned the soil to dust and a man's hope to a forgotten currency. Inside, Elara Miller stood at the single grimy window, her reflection a pale ghost in the glass. Her hands, once skilled at stitching fine embroidery for the ladies in Cheyenne, were now raw and calloused from hauling brackish water and scrubbing threadbare clothes on a washboard. She watched her husband Ben out in the field, not working the land, for there was nothing left to work, but kneeling in the dust, his head bowed in his hands. A proud man, broken by a relentless sky. What would you do to save the ones you love? What line would you cross when the world has given you nothing but hard choices and empty promises? Keep watching. This is the story of a single choice, made in the dark of night, that would haunt a family for generations. Their children were the quietest victims. Liam, 9 years old, with his father's thoughtful eyes, had already learned the weight of worry. He'd sneak extra food onto his younger sister's plate when he thought no one was looking. Cora, just 6, still possessed the magical resilience of childhood, chasing imaginary butterflies in the dust. Her laughter, a stark, beautiful lie against the backdrop of decay. And baby John, swaddled and listless in his cradle, was the reason Elara's heart beat in a constant, frantic rhythm of fear. He was too thin, his cries too weak. They all were. The stranger came on a horse that gleamed with health, a grotesque parody of vitality in that wasted place. He introduced himself as Mr. Silas Thorne from the Thorne Timber Company back in Pennsylvania. His suit was of fine eastern wool, untouched by the dust that coated everything else. "Mrs. Miller," he'd said, tipping his hat with a gloved hand, his voice smooth as oil. "I've come with an offer for your husband, a proposition that could solve all your present difficulties." The offer was deceptively simple. Ben, known as the best tracker and guide in the territory, would lead a Thorne timber crew deep into the untouched pine valleys of the Bitterroot Range, land he knew like the back of his hand, land he loved with a fierce protective passion. In return, they would receive a sum of money so large it made Elara's knees weak and her stomach clench with simultaneous hope and shame. Enough to pay off the bank that circled like a vulture, to buy seed and livestock for a decade, to get little John the proper medicine and nourishing food he needed to thrive. Ben refused. He'd taken the contract, his rough, work-worn fingers tracing the elegant script, his jaw set in a hard line. "Those valleys are the last clean water for 100 miles, Mr. Thorne," he'd said, his voice low and steady. "What your axes don't destroy, your sawdust will choke, the game will leave, the rivers will sour. I won't be the man who poisons this land for a handful of coin. My name won't be attached to that." But a handful of coin was the difference between life and death. It was the sound of baby John's labored breathing in the night. It was the hollow look in Liam's eyes. It was the way Cora's dresses grew shorter each season. That night, after Ben had fallen into an exhausted, dreamless sleep, Elara slipped from their bed. The moon was a cold sliver in the sky, offering no comfort. She stole the contract from his coat pocket, the paper crisp and alien in her hands. She lit a single precious tallow candle and stared at Silas Thorne's elegant looping signature. She thought of the earth, yes, of the sacredness Ben saw in it. But then she thought of the fever that had taken her firstborn, of the way the banker had looked at her last week, of the terrifying lightness of her baby in her arms. She thought of the land, and then she made her choice. She chose her children. At dawn, before the sun could rise and judge her actions, she rode the old mare to the nearby town of Dust Crossing. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. In the quiet of the telegraph office, with the clerk watching her with bored curiosity, she signed her name on the dotted line, Elara Miller. It felt like signing a confession. Silas Thorne, who seemed to have expected her, handed her a heavy leather pouch. The gold coins inside clinked with a final damning sound. She hid it in the depths of her apron, its weight feeling both like a salvation and the heaviest sin she would ever carry. When she returned and told Ben, the light in his eyes, the light that had drawn her to him across a crowded dance floor all those years ago, didn't just dim. It was extinguished, snuffed out in an instant. "You had no right," he whispered, the words more devastating than any shout. They stood in the kitchen, the space between them suddenly a vast, uncrossable chasm. "You went behind my back. You traded our honor, my word, for a full belly." "I traded our starvation for a chance," she cried, the gold feeling like a brand against her leg. The dam of her fear broke, and the words tumbled out in a torrent. "I did it for our children, for John. Can't you see that? Are you so blinded by your principles that you can't see them fading away right in front of you?" "Did you ever stop to think," Ben said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register, "that the man I am, the father I am, is built on that word? That my honor is the only true inheritance I can give them? You bought them food, Elara, and in doing so, you sold them their father's soul." The words were a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Have you ever made a choice with your whole heart, believing it was the only way, only to be told by the person you love most that it was the ultimate betrayal? To see the love in their eyes replaced by a cold, mo-shing disappointment that feels like a winter frost settling deep in your bones. Elara's journey into the devastating consequences of that choice is just beginning. The day Ben left with the Thorn Timber crew was the coldest morning of the year, a bitter irony that did not escape Elara. He moved with a stiff, mechanical efficiency, packing his bedroll and his rifle. He did not look at her as he tightened the girth on his saddle. He hugged the children, holding them so tight it seemed he wanted to imprint the feel of them onto his very skin, as if he were a man heading to the gallows, storing up his last precious memories. "Papa, when will you be back?" Liam asked, his small voice trembling with the effort to be brave. Ben's eyes, finally, lifted and met Elara's over the boy's head. There was no anger left in them, just a vast, empty sorrow, a landscape of grief more barren than the one outside their door. "When the work is done, son," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "When the work is done." He rode away without a backward glance. Elara stood on the porch, the Wyoming wind whipping her dress around her legs, the gold now hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen, burning a hole in the very foundation of her home. She had gotten what she wanted. The money was safe. The farm was saved from the bank. And as Ben disappeared into the shimmering heat-hazed horizon, a silence fell upon the homestead, heavier than any she had ever known. He was riding into the wilderness, and a part of her soul, the part that still believed in love's invincibility, knew with a chilling certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. If your heart is already breaking for this family, if you need to know what becomes of Ben Miller in those deep, dark woods, then you cannot miss what happens next. Subscribe now, because the next part will change everything you think you know about sacrifice and what truly lurks in the heart of the wild. The silence Ben left behind was a living thing. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping child or the gentle hush of a snow-covered field. This was a heavy, watchful silence that filled the Miller homestead, pressing in on Elara from the warped wooden walls. For the first week, she moved through the rooms like a ghost, the memory of his shattered expression a constant companion. The children, sensing the seismic shift in their world, became quiet and clingy. Cora stopped chasing her imaginary butterflies. Liam took to sitting on the porch step for hours, staring down the empty road as if his will alone could conjure his father's return. Elara tried to fill the void with action. She used a single gold coin from the cursed pouch to pay off the bank. The transaction was swift and anticlimactic. The banker's sneer vanished, replaced by a fawning, unctuous respect that made her skin crawl. She bought a bottle of proper cough syrup for baby John from the traveling doctor, its glass dark and promising. She purchased a bolt of sturdy blue cloth for new dresses and trousers, and a second-hand copy of Robinson Crusoe for Liam. But the gifts, meant to be symbols of a new security, landed with a dull thud of confusion. The children accepted them with quiet thanks, their eyes still shadowed with the unspoken question. At what cost? The gold, hidden beneath the floorboard, no longer felt like salvation. It was a lodestone of guilt, its weight pulling her deeper into a mire of regret with every passing day. She had wanted to save them, but in doing so, She had severed the vital, invisible cord that connected them as a family. Ben's absence was a phantom limb, an ache that never subsided. Then the letters stopped. The first few had arrived with a blessed regularity, delivered by a dusty rider every 2 weeks. They were short, practical, and devoid of the man she loved. The trail is steep. The crew is rough. The weather holds. Tell the children I think of them. He never asked after her. The space where a wife's name should be was a deliberate, painful blank. After the fourth letter, nothing came. 3 weeks bled into 4, and the silence from the Bitterroots became a roaring in Elara's ears, a crescendo of dread that drowned out all other thought. Finally, a letter arrived, but the paper was cheap and rough, unlike the fine stock Ben had used. The handwriting was a clumsy, unpracticed scrawl, the ink blotted in places, as if the writer's hand had been shaking. "Mrs. Miller, there's been an incident in the Bitterroots. The men are spooked. Your husband, he's changed. He argues with Mr. Thorne. He talks of things we don't understand, ancient things, wrong things he says are in the woods. He's not the same man who came here. Some say the mountain has gotten into his head. We are cutting the season short. Expect us within the fortnight." It was signed by a name she didn't recognize, Jed, a cook's helper. The cold stone of guilt in her stomach turned to sharp, crystalline ice. What had her bargain truly set in motion? What wrong things lived in the shadows of those pristine valleys? She had sent her husband into the heart of it, and the heart, it seemed, had fought back. The man who returned to the Miller homestead a week later was a stranger wearing her husband's face. He arrived on a different horse, a skittish, hollow-eyed mare that was all bones and nervous energy. The man who dismounted was gaunt. His skin stretched tight over the prominent bones of his face, giving him a skeletal sharpness. His clothes, the same ones he'd left in, hung on him like rags on a scarecrow. But it was his eyes that made Elara's blood run cold. Once a clear, steady blue, the color of a Wyoming summer sky, they were now the color of a storm-churned sea, murky and darting, never settling on one thing for more than a second. They held a haunted, frantic light, as if he were perpetually seeing something just over your shoulder. "Pa," Liam said, his voice a mixture of hope and terror. He ran forward, then stopped a few feet short, his small body tense with uncertainty. Ben looked at his son as if he were a complex equation he couldn't solve. His gaze was distant, unfocused. "The trees have eyes, boy," he muttered, his voice a dry, rasping thing, stripped of its former warmth. "They watch. They remember the bite of the axe. They whisper on the wind." He walked past his family and into the house, his movements jerky and unnatural. He paused on the threshold, his hand hovering over the doorframe, as if feeling for something. Elara's carefully restored home, the patched roof, the well-stocked pantry, the children's new clothes. He surveyed it all with a cold, clinical detachment, showing no recognition, no relief. It was as if he were assessing a campsite, not the home he had built with his own hands. The family dinner that night was a funeral masquerading as a celebration. Elara had cooked a stew with real meat, a luxury they hadn't known in years. Ben picked at it, pushing the chunks of potato and carrot around his bowl. His ears seemed attuned to a frequency only he could hear. He would flinch at the settling of the logs in the stove, his head snapping toward the window, at the cry of a distant nighthawk. "The valley is sacred," he said abruptly, his voice cutting through the fragile silence Elara was desperately trying to maintain. "Thorne, he knew, and he sent us in anyway. He lied. The river there." Ben's eyes lost focus, staring at the flickering lamplight. "It runs red, not with iron ore, with memory. The memory of the blood spilled when the world was young." Elara reached across the table, her hand covering his. His skin was cold. "Ben, what are you talking about? You're home now. You're safe. Thorne is gone. The work is done." His head snapped toward her, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, the man she loved was visible, trapped behind a wall of primal terror. He looked at her with a desperate, pleading clarity. "There is no safety, Elara. Not from this. Not for any of us. I broke a covenant. We all did. We cut into living flesh and we heard it scream." He pulled his hand away, as if her touch burned him. "And for what? For this?" He gestured vaguely at the comfortable kitchen. the full bowls, his lip curling in a sneer of pure contempt. For pretty dresses and full bellies. It's a devil's bargain, woman. We've traded our souls for a bowl of stew. He stood so suddenly, his chair fell backward with a crash that made them all jump. I have to make it right, he announced to the empty air, and shuffled out the door into the gathering twilight. From that day on, Ben was a ghost in his own life. He no longer tended to the farm. Instead, he spent his days at the property's edge, where their cleared land met the wild prairie. There, he built strange, intricate patterns from fallen twigs, smooth stones, and bleached animal bones. They weren't mere piles. They were spirals and concentric circles, symbols that made Elara's head ache if she looked at them for too long. He would speak to the wind, his conversations a low, frantic murmur. He wasn't the loving father who had left. He was a prophet of a dreadful, unseen God, a sentinel guarding them from a threat only he could perceive. The final straw, the moment the last vestige of hope crumbled to dust in Elara's heart, came a week later. She was woken in the dead of night by a sound, or rather, the lack of one. The house was too quiet. She slipped from bed, her heart hammering, and padded silently to the children's room. Ben was standing over baby John's crib. The moonlight streaming through the window glinted off the long, sharp blade of his hunting knife, held loosely in his hand. He was staring down at the sleeping infant, his expression one of intense, sorrowful concentration. "It's the only way," he whispered, his voice a thread of sound. "To free him, to send his spirit back to the clean earth before it's too late, before it's tainted by what we've done." A soundless scream tore through Elara. She launched herself across the room, snatching her son from the crib, holding his warm, sleeping body tight against her chest. Ben didn't fight her. He didn't even seem surprised. He just looked at the knife in his hand with a confused expression, as if he couldn't quite remember how it had gotten there. "Ben," she sobbed, her body trembling violently. "It's John, your son." He blinked, his gaze clearing for a fleeting second. He looked from the knife to her terrified face, to the baby in her arms. A profound, weary confusion washed over his features. Without a word, he turned and shuffled out of the room, back into the darkness of the house. Elara sank to the floor, clutching her son, tears of pure, undiluted terror, finally breaking free. The man she loved was gone, not dead, but possessed, a haunted vessel, and the thing inside him, the memory of the screaming valley, the whispering trees, was threatening to destroy the very family she had sacrificed everything to save. Her choice hadn't just cost her his love, it had cost him his mind, and it was a price that was now coming due in blood. What is the terrible truth Ben discovered in the Bitterroot Valleys? What has taken hold of him? The answer is more shocking and ancient than you can imagine. Let me know in the comments what you think is haunting Ben, and don't forget to like this video. Your support ensures we can keep bringing you these deep, dark tales from the forgotten corners of the world. The home was now a prison, its walls a fragile barrier against the enemy within. Elara began barring the door at night, not to keep the wilderness out, but to keep her husband's new, fractured consciousness from wandering. Ben's madness was not the raving, violent kind one could fight against. It was a quiet, insidious possession. He'd spend hours tracing those same unsettling patterns in the dirt floor of the barn, his fingers moving with a frantic, ritualistic precision. He spoke in low, continuous murmurs of the old blood in the soil and the price for the silence we stole. His words were no longer just the ramblings of a broken mind. They felt like warnings, spoken in a language only the land could understand. One afternoon, a week after the incident with the knife, Silas Thorne returned. His fine Eastern suit was gone, replaced by mud-spattered practical trousers and a jacket that had seen rough travel. The polished, unflappable businessman was gone. In his place was a man with a frantic, hunted look in his eyes, his gaze perpetually scanning the tree line as if expecting an ambush. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice tight, refusing her gesture to enter the house. He stood on the porch as if it were the deck of a sinking ship. "Where is he? I need to speak with your husband." "He's unwell," Elara said. her voice sharp with a bitterness that had been steeping for weeks. She crossed her arms, a lone sentinel guarding her ruined home. Because of you, because of what you led him into out there. Thorn let out a harsh, humorless bark of a laugh that held no mirth, only an edge of hysteria. Unwell. We're all unwell, woman. Do you think this is confined to your homestead? He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Men are vanishing from my camp. Not running away, vanishing. One moment they're there, the next, only a cold spot in the air remains. They hear whispers in the pines when there's no wind. They see things moving in the periphery of their vision. Things that are there, and then, not. He ran a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. Your husband? He was the first to listen. He was the first to truly understand what we had disturbed. He needs to tell me what he knows, how to appease it, how to make it stop before it follows us all the way back to our own hearts. A cold certainty settled in Elara's soul. It was real. The horror wasn't just a sickness in Ben's mind, conjured by guilt and exhaustion. It was a real, palpable presence from the woods. And Silas Thorne, in his greed, had known, or at least suspected, that the valley was not just timber, but something else, something ancient and vengeful that he had willfully awakened. Get off my land, Elara said, her voice low and shaking with a cold, clean rage. You brought this upon us. You poisoned my husband with your greed. You will get no help from this house. As Thorne, his face a mask of frustrated terror, mounted his horse and rode away, a figure emerged from the shadowed interior of the barn. It was Ben, but something was different. The frantic, twitching energy was gone. His posture was straighter, his movements more deliberate. A terrifying, ancient calm had settled over him, as if the frantic prophet had been replaced by a high priest preparing for a solemn, dreadful rite. He knows now, Ben said, his voice clear and deep, resonating with a timbre she hadn't heard since before he left. It was his voice, but it was filled with a sorrow as deep and old as the mountains. He knows the price of waking a sleeping heart, but he doesn't know how to pay it. Ben's eyes, still haunted, now held a piercing, dreadful clarity as they met hers. I do. Ben walked toward her, and for the first time since his return, he was truly present. The love was still there, a flickering ember beneath the layers of cosmic grief and terror. But so was a profound, unwavering resolve. It's not a monster, Elara, he explained, his voice weary with the weight of impossible knowledge. It's the land itself, the spirit of the valley, the heart of the woods. Thorn's axes didn't just cut trees, they bit into its living flesh. I felt its pain. It's old. So old we are just brief, flickering things to it, like mayflies on a river. But it is in agony, and its agony has a voice. He looked toward the bitter roots, a distant, pained recognition in his gaze. It screams through the wind, it bleeds through the river, and its anger is a storm that will not be calmed with words. He told her then what had to be done. Thorn's operation had to be driven out, not with violence or negotiation, but with truth. The land's pain had to be made manifest to the men, made so real and so terrifying that no amount of gold could make them stay. It required a conduit, a focusing of that ancient will. But it will require a sacrifice, Ben said, his eyes holding hers, begging for her understanding. A willing one, not of blood, not of life, but of the self. A piece of our own prosperity, given back to the soil. An offering of remorse. To show it, we remember what we are. That we are stewards, not masters. That we understand the debt. He turned his gaze from the distant mountains to the healthy green field that her gold had bought. The field now sprouting with the first hopeful shoots of a saved harvest. It will want that back, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. The life we built with its pain, the future we bought with its silence. Elara understood with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating. The money, the security, it was all tainted. It was blood money, paid not just in felled trees, but in the desecration of something sacred. To be free of the haunting, to save Ben's soul, to truly honor the world they were a part of, they had to give it all up. They had to prove their worth was not measured in coin, but in respect. Together, in the fading afternoon light, they went to the kitchen. Elara knelt, her hands trembling, not with fear, but with a solemn purpose. She pried up the loose floorboard and took out the heavy leather pouch containing the remainder of Silas Thorne's gold, every last gleaming coin that had not been spent. The children watched from the doorway, silent and wide-eyed, sensing the gravity of the moment. They walked to the field, to the richest, most fertile spot, where the soil was dark and loamy. Ben took a shovel and began to dig. The sound of the metal biting into the earth was the only noise in the heavy silence. "It's not about the gold," Ben whispered, his muscles straining as the hole grew deeper. "It's about the intent, the acknowledgement. We are giving back what was taken. We are returning the energy, acknowledging the debt." When the hole was deep enough, Elara stepped forward. She opened the pouch and, one by one, let the gold coins fall into the dark earth. They landed with soft, final thuds, their gleam quickly swallowed by the soil. It was the most irrational, foolish act imaginable to any outside eye. But as the last coin disappeared, and they began to shovel the dark soil back into the hole, patting it down firmly, a profound and palpable change occurred. The oppressive, watchful feeling that had clung to Ben, to the very air around the farm, simply lifted. It was like a fever breaking. The air felt lighter, cleaner. The birds, which had been silent, began to tentatively chirp in the nearby copse of trees. Ben swayed on his feet, dropping the shovel. When Elara rushed to catch him, he collapsed into her arms, his body racked with great heaving sobs. But these were not the tears of a madman. They were the tears of a man who had been to hell and back, who had carried an unbearable weight and had finally been allowed to set it down. "It's done," he breathed, his voice muffled against her shoulder, the voice of her husband, whole and returned to her. "It's over." They never saw or heard from Silas Thorne again. Whispers filtered down from the territory months later that his timber operation had collapsed. His crew had abandoned him en masse, driven mad by shared nightmares and the relentless, whispering presence in the pines, leaving his equipment to rust in the sacred valley. The Miller farm, stripped of its ill-gotten wealth, struggled through the following years. But it was an honest struggle. The drought eventually broke. Ben's mind was his own again, though the memory of the horror was a scar on his soul, a quiet sorrow he would carry always. He no longer looked at the wilderness as a resource to be conquered, but as a relative to be respected. They taught their children a different lesson then. Not of prosperity at any cost, but of balance, of listening to the world around you, of understanding that every action has an echo in the unseen fabric of things. They became known as odd but wise, the family who could read the weather in the behavior of the animals, who knew when to plant and when to let the land rest, who understood the soil. Years later, on the exact spot where they had buried the gold, a sapling began to grow. It was a tree unlike any other in Wyoming, with bark that had a peculiar, almost metallic sheen and leaves that shimmered with a faint copper hue in the light of the setting sun. It grew straight and strong, a beautiful living monument to a terrible choice, a profound sacrifice, and a hard-won redemption. Elara had bought her family's future with gold, and it had very nearly consumed them all in a tide of madness. She had saved them, not by acquiring more, but by having the courage to give it all back. The greatest strength, she learned, is not in what you can acquire, but in what you are willing to sacrifice for the ones you love and for the silent living world you call home. What would you have buried to save your family's soul? Share this story with someone who needs to remember that some debts can't be paid with money, and that the deepest peace often comes from letting go. If these are the kinds of tales that stay with you, that make you look at the world a little differently, then make sure you are subscribed. Our next journey into the wild and the human heart begins soon.